Thanks, Chuck. Individuals who struggle with weight gain are often blamed for not having the self-discipline to follow advice handed down since the days of Hippocrates, to eat less, exercise more. To that, Dr. Jeffery Friedman suggests that we move beyond this 2,000-year-old prescription and instead develop strategies that are based on 21st century science. In late 1994, Dr. Friedman's research on various aspects of obesity received national attention when it was announced that he and his colleagues had isolated the mouse OB gene and its human homologue. And when that gene is expressed in fat tissue, it produces the hormone leptin, a molecular signal that reports nutritional status to the neural circuitry that controls appetite. That discovery was the culmination of an 8-year odyssey that Dr. Friedman describes as a singular event in his life, one that was absolutely exhilarating. By linking obesity to genetics, he has waged a war on obesity, not the obese, which was the title of a viewpoint Dr. Friedman penned for the journal Science when in 2003, he urged us to recast social attitudes on obesity, remove its stigma, and refrain from hurling blame. Rather, he advises, we should apply the same tactic to obesity used to combat the war on cancer. That is, he writes, through identification of the molecular components that regulates body weight, by defining what is different about the system between lean and obese individuals, and by disentangling how developmental, emotional, environmental factors alter the function of this system. While there may not be a silver bullet to defeat one of the most pressing public health problems in the world, we now know from Dr. Friedman's work that because we are all different, we need to continue to study the interaction between genes, brains, and the environment to understand all of the biological facets underlying our eating behavior. This level of understanding will guide our search for effective therapies that will improve overall fitness in a way that can be maintained over the long term, and a hope that one day, modern medicine will deliver a prescription to accompany the one proffered since the days of Hippocrates. Dr. Jeffery Friedman is currently the Marilyn M. Simpson Professor at the Rockefeller University, an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and the director of the Starr Center for Human Genetics. He graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, magna cum laude, and at the age of 22, received his medical degree from Albany Medical College of Union University. And after completing a medical residency, he went off to serve as a postgraduate fellow at Rockefeller, where he later received his PhD. He has been a member of the National Academy of Sciences since 2001 and a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences since 2005. Perhaps my greatest challenge in writing this introduction was summarizing his long list of national and international prizes and awards, a list that was lengthened just last Friday in New York City, where he and Dr. Douglas Coleman received the prestigious Lasker Award for laying the groundwork for future research in obesity. And this came on the heels of a year when he collected both the Caio Medical Science Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Life Science and Medicine and the Shore Prize for Significant Breakthrough in Academic and Scientific Research that has resulted in a positive and profound impact on mankind. Other honors include the Pisano Award, the Gardner International Award, the Kovalenko Medal, the Bristol-Myers Squibb Award for Distinguished Achievement in Metabolic Research, and the Danone International Prize for Nutrition. On top of all that, he's busy raising twin 12-year-old girls. And he's very comfortable in the hockey arena, both as a player and as a Ranger fan. It is truly an honor for me to invite Dr. Friedman to the podium. Over the past several years, it has been great fun sharing the story of leptin with my students. It is truly one of the most remarkable examples of how a single molecule can influence a complex behavior. Thank you, Dr. Friedman, and welcome.
So I'll just speak into the mic. Perfect. Well, thanks, Mike, for that really lovely and generous introduction. It's difficult to segue from that into my talk, but I will. Some of the students and I were talking before, and I promised two of them that I would use the word segue at the earliest possible opportunity. Well, I'd like to begin by first of all thanking you for giving me the opportunity to visit. This is really a lovely college and a wonderful event. It occurred to me looking through the previous 45 such conferences that one could get a wonderfully broad and interesting education simply by watching the videos of all 45 of those that range among a set of topics that are interesting, pressing, and reflect, I think, the prescience of this institution to bring big questions to campus with an opportunity for people to discuss them. Now, the topic that I'm going to speak about today really focuses not at the larger level that, such as you've heard about in the previous two talks, but really focuses on at the level of the individual. And shown here are images of two images of individuals who obviously differ with respect to their body weight. And before even beginning, I'd ask each of you to reflect for a moment and think to yourself, or ask yourself, why are these two individuals different? How is it that one individual has so much more adipose tissue than the other, and what does this mean? And think also about what judgments you might or might not make about that person, because if asked why the individual on your left is obese, most people would, I think, correctly say, well, a child eats too much and exercises too little. But that, I think, ignores the deeper and more important question, which is, why is this so? Why is that individual eating more and perhaps exercising less? And so what I'd like to try to do today is answer that question by deconstructing obesity and at least presenting for you a scientist's view on this condition. And so today I'll just talk about two topics in turn. One is just in a general way the causes of obesity, and then I'll follow that with a discussion of how the identification of leptin has informed our understanding of how body weight is regulated. Now, this is a challenge, in part because if I were talking to you about any of the conditions listed on this slide, chances are most of you would accept what I have to say at the outset, and if pressed, you would simply, with the specific set of questions, if pressed, you would probably defer to the experts. That actually isn't true about obesity. Everyone has such an intimate connection to food and their own personal experience eating, dieting, trying to maintain their weight, that everyone has a deeply held set of beliefs about this topic. And for the most part, very few people have any great interest in what I have to say at all. In part, I think, because everyone has their own set of convictions that range greatly in terms of what they are. And this range of opinions is reflected in the press, where there are innumerable articles sort of elaborating on why weight is so different. Now, whatever one's opinion about the causes and potential remedies of this treatment, there's no question that it represents a significant public health risk. For reasons we don't fully understand, obesity increases the risk of diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, fatty liver, some forms of cancer, a set of diseases that in aggregate are the principal causes of morbidity and mortality in the developed world and are growing problems in the developing world. Now, there's one important fact here, which is that while obesity increases disease risk, it is also the case that the severity of these conditions is ameliorated even with modest weight loss. So modest weight loss, so one doesn't have to normalize weight to improve health, and I'll come back to this and emphasize this at the end of the talk. And so the point here, however, is that it is intrinsically difficult to take weight off. Now, the severity of these conditions is is illustrated in this slide, and I just want you to focus on this magenta line here in women and in men, which shows that when you look at relative mortality or relative risk of death over time as a function of body mass index, an indicator of adiposity or obesity that I'll have more to say about, the relative risk of death increases as soon as you increase above a threshold 30. BMI is weight over height squared. And so as body BMI rises, so too increases the risk of disease and death, and so too increases the social stigma that lead obese people to earn less than no better talented people and be promoted less readily. So here again, one might ask the question, if you're up here and suffering health effects and potentially social stigma, why don't people just lose the weight and come down to the flat part of this curve and live a life of health? Well, it's not so easy. And so given the fact that body weight is quite stable and that most diets are unsuccessful over the long term in effecting weight change, one, I think, might ask the question, why is it that the obese can't typically reduce their weight to that of the average weight individual? Well, there are three general explanations for why it is that obese people remain so. One suggestion is that the obese lack a level of willpower that's normally exercised by lean people. I find this point of view is more often favored by lean people. A second possibility is lifestyle and environment, that we live in a modern, quote, toxic environment, and in this environment, obesity becomes rampant. And then the third possibility is that there's a biological and genetic basis, that biology and genes account for differences in weight and difficulties in changing weight away from some homeostatic so-called set point. Now, when I used to give talks, I would sometimes ask people to vote their preference for each of these three before and after I spoke. I stopped doing that when one day fewer people voted for biology and genes when I finished than when I began. I do want to emphasize, however, that in a sense this is a false choice, and most people feel compelled when asked to pick just one of them. I think for any other condition but obesity, if asked what's the relative importance of each of these factors, biology, environment, higher cognitive factors such as willpower, people would say, well, it's plausible to suggest there's a biological system that can be modulated by behavioral and environmental factors. But for reasons that we could talk about, I think debate on or discussion about this subject is really polarized, I think, in a manner that's often at odds with the scientific evidence. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes now is share with you my point of view about the relative importance of each of these components as a prelude at the end of trying to unify them, or at least suggest to you that they're not mutually exclusive contributors. So what about willpower? Well, this is a message that obese and lean people hear all the time. Obese people are advised to eat less and exercise more. And that message is relayed in any number of settings, partly is illustrated in this sort of mock infomercial that the people at the Howard Hughes Institute made for me. So I'll play this for you now because you'll all recognize this.
Are you tired of being overweight? Tired of the latest weight loss fads? Wouldn't you like a plan that just works? Well, now it's easy. Just follow the Kant-Miss weight loss program and you too can be slim and trim. Just follow our simple meal plans and your extra pounds will disappear like magic. If you really want to lose weight, decide now to follow the Kant-Miss weight loss program.
So the operant word there is decide now. The idea is that you can voluntarily control what you weigh. All you have to do is decide. What flashed at the bottom is a requirement now of the FDA of all diet plans, which is that the success rate be made public. And the success rate of these plans is actually quite dismal for effecting large degrees of weight loss over the long term. Now, why might it be that voluntary factors have limited potency for effecting weight change in anything other than a minority of individuals? And we can talk about that minority in a moment. Well, for one thing, there's pretty good evidence that there must be a biological system for regulating body weight. Body weight is remarkably stable in individuals who are not actively trying to change their weight. This has been established in studies all over the world, in Sweden, South Africa, Israel, and elsewhere. If you're not actively trying to change your weight, year on year, one's weight is naturally changes very little. It's within just a few pounds. Now, all living organisms obey the laws of thermodynamics, and if you extrapolate from that, what it simply suggests is that if your body weight or the amount of energy you have stored as fat has not changed in that year, then the amount of food you've eaten had to have been perfectly balanced against the number of calories you burned. And that's a tall order, considering that over the average year, an adult will consume approximately 1 million calories. And so those 1 million calories would have to have been precisely balanced against energy expended, or your weight would have changed. And for most people, it hasn't. These numbers get even more profound if you now consider consumption over a lifetime or a decade. Over the course of a lifetime, we'll consume tons worth of fat, protein, and carbohydrate, convert that to waste, heat, and a small amount of work, all the while maintaining a relatively constant body mass. Now, if you extrapolate from this into a back-of-the-envelope calculation, assuming that weight would change less than 10 pounds per decade, which is what the evidence would suggest, what you're left with is the notion that the number of calories in had to have been balanced against the number of calories out with approximately 99.6% precision. This exceeds the ability of dietitians to actually surmise the calorie content of food that you might begin to eat by several logs, which means that if you just have a plate of food in front of you, you can't really tell how many calories there are, and you could not do as well as nature appears to do quite naturally. This situation is evident even if you are diligent about looking at error rates on food labels, where the error rates can be quite staggeringly high. In fact, ironically here, the error rates are highest among organic producers or smaller producers who don't have the resources to as assiduously count or monitor calories as do bigger growers. Now, the idea here that somehow energy that we eat is balanced against the energy that we consume is suggested for more than 100 years that there must be some basic system or basic drive that regulates food intake and that essentially counts calories for us, that somehow there's some natural means for inventorying calories. And it's very easy to see evidence for this sort of self-monitoring of calories in animals. In this classic experiment by Wilson et al., what was done was to take animals and overfeed them through a tube. This is something called gavage feeding. And so over that interval, you see, while the tube is in place, the voluntary food intake of the animal decreases. It's not hungry because it's eating all the time, and its weight increases. But the second you stop overfeeding this animal, its food intake remains low compared to a control group until such time as its weight returns to that of the control group. As if the animal somehow knows that it's been overfed and is going to make adjustments until such time as its weight returns to that of its control group. And the same can be seen if you food restrict an animal. The animal will lose weight, but as soon as you restore the food to that animal, it goes right back to that of a control group, and it will overeat during this interval. As if here again, the animal somehow knows that it's been rendered thinner and is making adjustments in its energy balance to return to some starting point. What this begins to suggest is that there must be a biological system that's sensing that's taking an inventory of our number of calories stored and changing behavior as a consequence, at least in animals. Now, what this would imply is that perhaps there's a basic system in all of us that's similar to that which I just described for animals, and that it's in opposition to a conscious drive. And there are lots of examples of basic drives being imposed by higher cognitive wishes. And it's very easy to demonstrate this even in this audience in an experiment. I mean, basically, you could decide to stop breathing, but sooner or later the basic drive to breathe will win out. Same for all these other traits, it's just that in many cases they play out over a long period of time, so we no longer recognize the potency of the basic drive. I mean, there's a simple way to sort of emphasize this point further, the notion that our basic drives cannot be so easily overcome in all cases by willpower. Sometimes when I give talks, I've offered to give students $5 million if they could stop breathing through the end of my talk. And I stopped making that offer when one student stood up and said, "Does it count if I'm dead?" So the offer does not stand. But it's this idea that there's a basic drive to eat that overcomes that ultimately overcomes maybe the higher cognitive wish to eat less, that I think is the subject actually of the talk I'll give today, and that explains the fact that most diets are ineffective. So that 95% of individuals who lose substantial amounts of weight, more than, let's say, 25 pounds or more, or even greater degrees of weight loss, return to their pre-dieting weight within a couple of years. Most diets fail. And I would propose to you it's because while willpower can effect changes over the shorter term, eventually the basic drive wins out. What about lifestyle and environment? Well, you might see this quote in many different places, or quotes like it. No age has ever afforded more instances of corpulency than our own. This was Thomas Short in 1727. So we hear this even more frequently today than I'm quite sure Thomas Short did. So where does the idea come from that obesity is increasing to the extent that it is, and what do the data really mean? Well, the sort of data that are presented to defend this point of view are similar to what you saw earlier. It was basically estimated that 15% of the population was obese in 1980, and now that number, well, as of 1999, that number had doubled. And people then argue that our genes haven't changed in this interval, so it must be the environment. Well, first of all, that statement is not true in terms of how natural selection actually works, and this was alluded to in the last talk. Natural selection is most powerful over the short term in selecting among pre-existing variants that are better suited for changing environmental conditions. So the notion that natural selection can't be used to invoke changes in allele frequencies over the short term is not correct. But there's another reason, actually, why this statement is wrong, and that the environment the statement that the environment has to be accounting for all the changes we see over time, and it has to do with the way we measure body weight. As I mentioned before, body weight is adiposity or fat content is measured by a metric known as body mass index. That's weight over height squared. And what's shown here are the approximate BMIs for 5'10" men who would be either 167, 202, or 242 pounds. If your BMI works out to be over 25, you're considered to be overweight, and if your BMI is over 30, you're considered to be obese. The point here is that we define overweight and obesity as a fixed threshold. Under it, you're not. Over it, you are. Now, there's a problem when you define a continuous trait such as BMI or body weight with fixed thresholds, and that is that the distribution doesn't have to change very much over a period of time to get a disproportionate increase in the number of people who exceed that threshold. So let me explain what I mean. Here's the threshold for obesity, BMI over 30, and here's a hand-drawn scheme of the distribution. In 1990, our BMI on average was 26.7, and 23.3% of the population was obese. In 2000, the average BMI was 28.1, and now 30% of the population was obese. So we saw about a 33% increase in the incidence of obesity over the course of a decade. This is true, but it was associated with, on average, 1.4 BMI unit increase, or 7 to 10 pounds. Now, I'm not here to argue that 7 to 10 pounds average weight gain is not important from a public health point of view. It's very important, and it would be very useful to try to reduce that average weight gain. It would improve public health. But I'd also like to suggest to you that you get a very different impression of what's been happening over that decade if you hear average weight increase 7 pounds to 7 to 10 pounds versus hearing 33% increase in obesity in a single decade. Now, what's shown here is the actual data, which was provided to me by Catherine Flegel. And if you correct for age and sex, which is not typically done when such calculations are made public, the differences in the distribution in 1991 versus 2000 are even less dramatic. Now, it's absolutely true that there are more people who are obese now at that point in time than previously, and there's probably more skewing. And I don't mean to minimize the possibility that there's been a secular trend towards more obesity. And we definitely would like to understand what in our environment is responsible for this increase and try to figure out remedies for it. But there's another question that we can ask at any moment in time. In an environment where everyone has unlimited access to calories, we can all, in this country at least by and large, eat as much or as little as we choose to. Why is weight so variable? How is it that in a relatively uniform environment, people can differ by hundreds of pounds, as you saw in one of the images a few moments ago? And the answer to that, to a very large extent, is genes. There are a number of ways to assess the genetic contribution to a human trait. One is by asking, does the trait segregate or run in families? Another is to ask, do biological parents, adoptive children tend to resemble their biological parents or their adoptive parents? And the last is to look at twin studies and ask, are monozygotic twins more alike for the trait than are dizygous twins? And in all cases for obesity, the conclusion is the same. There's a very substantial genetic contribution to differences in weight. In fact, if you look, obesity is as or more heritable than any trait that's been yet studied, with the exception of height. Approximately 75% of the variance in body weight can be accounted for by genetic factors. So genes explain a lot about why individuals weigh disparate amounts in a relatively uniform environment. Now, to emphasize to you the power of these genes, I want to tell you of a case report provided by Stephen O'Reilly and colleagues in Cambridge, England. This young boy, this is the image I began by showing you a picture of, was of normal weight at birth, but he began to develop morbid obesity in infancy. He was extraordinarily hyperphagic. The family reports having to padlock the refrigerator, and it's almost as if the child became a safecracker. He was so determined to eat. He was already pre-diabetic at the age of 4 when he weighed 90 pounds and had 57% body fat. Now, this child came from a highly inbred pedigree, the product of first cousin marriages, and he had a similarly affected 8-year-old cousin, a girl who weighed over 200 pounds, which is what I weigh. All right, 210, but it's close. Now, when you see an extreme phenotype in a highly inbred or consanguineous family, the cursory conclusion is that this might be genetic. And Steve O'Reilly reasoned that the phenotype of this child might be similar to that of a mouse strain that we had been studied and that you heard about a moment ago, the Obese mouse. This is a picture of an Obese mouse. It was identified at the Jackson Laboratory in 1950, and the only difference between this animal and its sibling littermates is a defect in a single gene. These animals live in the same cage with the same free access to food, and yet this animal weighs 3 times as much and has 5 times as much fat as his sibling littermates. And so we were captivated by that question in my laboratory and set out to identify the defective gene in these animals, and in 1994 identified it as encoding a protein hormone which we called leptin. Now, as you know, hormones are molecules made in one part of the body that signal information to other parts of the body, and this particular hormone is made by fat tissue in proportion to its mass. So if you have more fat tissue, you have more leptin. If you have less fat tissue, you have less leptin. And then leptin sets a nutritional signal to the brain, in particular a region of the brain known as the hypothalamus, which controls most basic behaviors, to regulate food intake or body weight. And so we identified this hormone and have been studying it in animals, and because it is a protein, we could make it in the laboratory. And what's shown here is a picture of an Obese mouse given either saline or a different mouse given leptin. So this hormone had the ability to reduce weight of animals by sending this nutritional signal. And in addition to affecting one of the 2 things that people suggest the obese should do, eat less, this hormone could accomplish in these animals, it also changed their activity. So this is an Obese mouse given saline and Obese mouse given leptin. As you can see, this animal moves around very little at all, and this animal moves around normally. And indeed, we could see this dramatic behavioral difference even before any weight was lost. In fact, we could see changes in activity even before the animal began to eat less. The point here is that this hormone in this system appears to play a role in regulating the levels of not only food intake but activity, the 2 things that the obese are advised to do more of. Well, anyway, O'Reilly reasoned that perhaps this child was deficient for this hormone leptin, similarly to these mice who carry a mutation in it. And so he set out to give the child this hormone in the blood by injection. And here's what happens. The child gets older. This has nothing to do with leptin. That's just the way things are. But despite getting taller, he became thinner, less diabetic, lower fat content. Now, early on, before the first leptin dose, they even gave this child a test meal, and this 3-year-old child ate in a single meal 2,000 calories, which is the number of calories an adult of my size will eat typically in a day. All right, 2,200 calories. But after a few leptin injections, the child now ate an age-appropriate number of calories, 180. So it was driving appetite in this child was not lack of willpower, it was not the environment, it was a lack of the hormone leptin. Now what happens in this child is that there's a mutation that disrupts the expression of this hormone, so no leptin is made. This is interpreted by the brain as meaning that there's no available fat stores at all. It basically signals that the child is starving. The child eats more, burns less, makes more and more fat, but it's to no avail. He can never generate the signal that shuts the system off. And now here's a picture of the child at the age of 8. This is the same child I showed, the same child as the one, this is the same child just before and after leptin therapy. I think this is a really important image because it emphasizes that the judgments you might make about children or adults who are very obese are as often as not going to be incorrect. And I'll come later to explain to you that at least 10% or more of morbid human obesity is the result of single gene defects, the rest being some combination of genes and environment. Now, in aggregate, this new information has established the following, that body weight is regulated by a homeostatic system. So at each individual's stable weight, a certain amount of fat is carried and a certain amount of leptin is made. And at that level, food intake equals energy expenditure. Now imagine you diet and fat mass and leptin level falls. Similar to the child who makes no leptin, this will be a stimulus to eat more. And such individuals will continue to eat until such time as fat mass and leptin level return to the starting point. Now imagine for a period of time you go on a binge of eating and you're a leptin-sensitive individual. Fat mass and leptin level will increase. This will in turn suppress appetite, again until such time as fat mass and leptin level return to the starting point. Now what this sets up, in a sense, is a biological system that seeks to maintain relative constancy of fat and a biological force that resists weight change in either direction. It doesn't mean that weight can change or can't be changed voluntarily. It does, however, mean that that voluntary wish will have to contend with a very powerful biological drive that opposes it. Now this also has evolutionary implications insofar as if there's a homeostatic system of this sort, it would suggest that there's a good reason not to be too fat or not to be too thin, and that this system sort of seeks out a happy medium. In the course of our own evolution as a species, both obesity and leanness carried with them certain risks. Leanness carries with it the increased risk of a starvation the next time there's a famine, but obesity increases the risk that we will be susceptible to predators. And so this system probably evolved to balance the relative risk of these two conditions. And without going into any detail about it, I'll simply say that those two relative risks of leanness and obesity are still evident in our population, though the relative potency or severity of those risks has changed and the cause of it has. So in any environment, I'd like to suggest to you that there's probably an optimal amount of fat and that this system sort of seeks out the balance between the two suboptimal extremes. Now, in a sense, one of the explanations here is that a biological system has emerged to avert the risk of starvation. And that explains something important about these children because, ironically, despite the fact that they're obese, they manifest a whole set of biological abnormalities that are normally evident not with obesity, but with starvation. So these children are often have insulin resistance and diabetes, they have infertility, they have thermoregulatory abnormalities, thyroid and immune problems, and so on. And ironically, these are typically the abnormalities you see in starved individuals. All of them have been corrected by leptin, and this and other data has suggested, in fact, that when fat mass is reduced and leptin level falls, the readout of this includes not only a stimulus to eat more, but what we might refer to as a starvation response with alterations to perhaps every biological system, the net effect of which is to try to conserve energy. So these are all energy, these systems all consume energy, and when leptin level falls, a set of biological responses are elicited that seek to conserve energy. Now this data has established, in fact, that leptin is a bona fide hormone and fat tissue is a bona fide endocrine organ, And the connection between leptin and other systems establishes it as, I think, a key mediator of nutritional information. Everyone accepts axiomatically that nutritional changes affect physiology. It's pretty clear now that a key means by which this happens is through changing the levels of this hormone. There are also a number of leptin deficiency syndromes that can be well treated with leptin, much the same as was the case for the leptin deficient child. And a partial list of these increasing number of syndromes is shown here. I'll mention to you, however, that mutations in the leptin gene causing obesity, similar to other hormones, are quite rare. And so there are only about 24 cases worldwide with a syndrome similar to that of the child I showed you a picture of. Now, this is important information physiologically. The nature of the condition in these children tells us a lot about what leptin does in humans, but it doesn't have much explanatory power for telling us what causes obesity. So the next question is, what are the levels of leptin in obesity? And that's shown here. If we now relate percent fat in humans to plasma leptin concentration in nanograms per mil, what you'll note is that as a general rule, the more obese individuals become, the higher their leptin levels, not the lower. Now, this is not uncommon in endocrinology. When we see high levels of a hormone, such as leptin, in the absence of a hormone effect, in this case, to reduce weight, it commonly denotes what's known as a hormone resistance syndrome. And the classic example of a hormone resistance syndrome is type 2 diabetes, where most type 2 diabetics actually have elevated, not reduced levels of the hormone insulin. And so here, too, obesity appears to be a leptin resistance syndrome. What does that mean? Well, imagine we have a leptin system that's configured something like this, and for some reason, there's a block to leptin action at its site of action in the brain. Well, less effective signal will get through. This will provide a stimulus to eat more, burn less, deposit more fat, and make more leptin, as if you can dial up or dial down body weight by changing leptin sensitivity. In fact, I think there's reason to believe that changing leptin sensitivity could be under selective pressure during evolution, so you can dial up the weight or dial down the weight of a population depending on the relative risks to it. Be that as it may, the available evidence from animals and now humans suggests that in most cases of obesity, for reasons that are not well understood but that are beginning to be gleaned, the ability of leptin to act on key neural centers that regulate weight are slightly abrogated. So the next question is, if you already make a lot of a hormone, what good does it do to give extra hormone? Might do some good sometimes, but in other cases it doesn't. A partial answer to that question was provided in the late 1990s by Steve Heimsfield and colleagues at publishing in a journal called JAMA. And what they were able to show was that if you jack up the leptin dose really high, at this dose, 0.3 milligrams per kilogram, in a small number of patients at least, you could see a statistically significant effect to reduce weight. The problem was this dose of leptin was just too large to administer to large numbers of people, and the lower doses didn't appear to have much of an effect. And so while there did appear to be some promise of efficacy for leptin by itself, it was not a commercially viable project, and there it languished. Now, in such circumstances, there are a few different approaches one can take to try to develop new therapies based on a hormone. One possibility would be to ask, is there a responder subset? Is it possible that some individuals will lose weight even with a relatively low dose of leptin? And indeed, that's the case. About a third of obese subjects will lose a significant amount of weight, getting even a lower dose of leptin. And there's reason to think that this is the subset of obese individuals who start out with lower leptin levels. There's another possibility that's become especially popular in the treatment of diabetes, which is to develop a hormone sensitizer. And so one other possible approach would be to see if there is some way to resensitize individuals to leptin. And now, it does appear that there is a leptin sensitizer, but to tell you about that, I need to say a little bit more about the complex systems that regulate food intake and body weight. Food intake and body weight are regulated by overlapping systems. One is a long-term system that maintains homeostatic control of fat mass, and leptin is a key player in that system. A second system controls what's known as meal pattern. These are the factors that make you feel hungry in between meals and feel full or satiated as a meal is concluded. A whole host of hormonal and neural signals mediate these short-term signals, and they include the hormone insulin, peptide YY, GLP-1, ghrelin, CCK, as well as vagal afferents. Many of you may have heard about some of these other signals. Now, both these systems talk to one another, and it's been reasoned for some time that if you affected only the long-term system, the short-term system might compensate and vice versa. And so this has underpinned the notion that one might need to treat obesity with combinations of agents that hit multiple pathways simultaneously. And so the brief story I'm going to tell you about now is a combination of leptin and this hormone amylin, marketed by a company known as Amylin Pharmaceuticals, which in the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you I consult for. Now, this molecule amylin is currently an anti-diabetic therapy. It's administered to diabetic patients as an adjunct to insulin because it has several desirable features. It suppresses glucagon secretion, it suppresses gastric absorption of glucose, and it also acts on the brainstem as a short-term signal to reduce weight. Amylin in human has been reported to have a 5% weight loss that's durable in patients receiving it. And so Amylin Pharmaceuticals wanted to ask what happens if we combine this short-term signal amylin with the long-term signal leptin. And in two separate studies, the data appear encouraging insofar as the combination in this case led to about a 13.5% weight loss that was more than 10% reduced compared to placebo. So there is promise for this combination, although I don't want to say anything other than there was enough efficacy to motivate these companies to maybe perhaps do larger trials to really establish whether the combination is safe and efficacious. What's important here, however, is that metabolic signals can and are likely to be used in the future, be used to manipulate weight, and that the sort of basic research that one does to decode these signals, I think, inevitably will lead to new therapies. Now, there's a final question, which is the one that captivates our lab today, which is to try to understand why leptin resistance develops in the first place. What's the molecular basis of leptin resistance? Since leptin acts on groups of neurons in the brain, this will require that we understand much more about how a peptide hormone can change the activity of a neural circuit that regulates behavior, and then what's different about its ability to activate this circuit in the leptin-resistant state. There's already a partial answer to this question in the form of key sets of neurons that respond to leptin in the brain. In the hypothalamus, one class of leptin receptor neurons expresses a peptide called NPY, and when these neurons fire, feeding is activated. A second class of neurons in the hypothalamus also expresses the leptin receptor, but in this case expresses a different peptide known as MSH, and this peptide acts on its receptor, the MC4 receptor, to inhibit feeding. Leptin works in part by inhibiting these neurons and activating these neurons. So if, as was the case in the child, you make no leptin, these neurons are maximally active, these are off and you eat more. With extra leptin, these are maximally active, and these are off and you eat less. And moreover, the system is said to be tuned, which means that quantitative changes in leptin concentration will change the relative balance between these pathways and influence whether you eat more or less as leptin levels change. Now, these neural pathways have been attracting a great deal of attention in recent years, in part because they'll form, I would hope, of the basis for new therapies in time, but also because mutations in it cause human obesity. These include leptin, the leptin receptor, alpha MSH, MC4 receptor, BDNF, TrkB, and other genes in this circuit. And we now know that more than 10% of morbid human obesity is a result of defects in one of these genes, most commonly either the leptin receptor or this MC4 receptor. So more than 10% of human obesity, morbid human obesity, is the result of a defect in a known gene. And there's very good reason to believe there are additional genes that cause obesity that we don't know about, and there's also reason to believe that there are, in other cases, combinations of genes acting together with environment to lead to obesity. I think this is a very important number to keep in mind if and when people might be inclined to make harsh judgments about the obese. Now, there's a deeper basic science question that underpins this, because no one actually believes that the decision about whether or not to eat is initiated in the hypothalamus. Clearly, there are other parts of the brain, and as a basic science exercise for future years, I'd like to suggest that here we have leptin, this hormone, acting on a discrete number of responding cells in the brain, and a measurable behavioral output in human. And so the deep question for the decades to come is going to be, what happens in between? How is this information decoded? How is behavior really controlled? Feeding is what's known as a classic complex motivational behavior. This is in contrast to a reflex, in which case a defined stimulus gives an invariant result. Here, a defined stimulus changes the probability of the behavior but doesn't guarantee it. So leptin levels and these other metabolic signals influence the likelihood that you'll eat but don't guarantee it. The same is true of sensory factors, smell, taste, and vision. Emotional factors are important in influencing whether or not you initiate feeding, as are, as I mentioned, higher cognitive factors. Now, this sort of reasoning has led people to believe for many decades that there must be some integratory centers in the brain that process complex information of this sort and convert it into a behavioral response. Not only do we not know how complex sensory information of this sort is processed in the brain, we don't even know where it's processed in the brain. And so a deep question for the coming decades that I think will prove tractable will be to understand how a diverse set of relevant inputs are integrated and lead to adaptive behavioral responses. Well, the elements of this complex neural circuit are years away, although they're under study in our laboratory and other places. I want to close by telling you that while we don't know very much yet about the real key elements of this neural circuit, we have in recent years developed a better understanding of a physiologic circuit. The physiological circuit is comprised of constitutes a classic feedback loop composed of an afferent signal in leptin, integratory centers in the brain that respond to it, and a set of end organ effects that regulate food intake and metabolism. Think of this in a way as a thermostat of sorts. You have a set point for fat mass and a signal, and if the signal doesn't match the set point, adaptive changes are developed. Now, this framework, I think, has important explanatory power for telling us why some people are obese and others aren't. I think it'll provide the basis for new therapies. But it's also a platform with which to better understand how environmental factors and psychological factors work. After all, these are not metaphysical metaphysical entities. They act on biological systems. And so I think the sort of framework that's been developed in the last decade and a half will help us in time better understand how environmental and behavioral factors exert their effects as well. Now, I think this is also important as we move forward in thinking of therapeutics. As Dr. Ferragamo told you, the advice the obese currently get is that they should basically eat less and exercise more. And as you heard, this was the advice of Hippocrates 2,000 years ago. And I'd like to suggest to you that perhaps advances in medical science will allow us to do better than simply reiterate a nostrum that was no more likely to work 2,000 years ago than it is today. Rather, we should approach this, as you also heard, in the same way as we would approach any other biological condition. Understand the molecular components of that state, or the physiologic state that regulates the parameter, in this case body weight. Understand what's different about that circuit or these molecules in the pathophysiologic state. Of course, understand how environmental and behavioral factors and developmental factors influence these pathways, and from this will come rational therapies. Now, I'm quite optimistic that there will be therapies that to emerge in the coming decades, with a caveat I'll come to in a moment. I think the caveat is that we will be able to reduce weight and improve health. I'm less optimistic that we'll be able to normalize weight in people who feel they should have an average weight, although I'm not sure that's a worthy aim in the first place. However, the development of these therapies is still probably years away. And in advance of that, I'm often asked to give people advice about what they might do if they do find themselves with health difficulties and overweight. And so I'd like to close by providing to you the advice I give obese people who ask, and everyone else, in advance of better medical therapies. Here again, focus on improving health. The cosmetic aspects of this are not what's important, or at least not what should be important. What's more important is to improve your health. And remember, it doesn't require normalizing your weight to see an improvement in these comorbidities. Exercise and eat a heart-healthy diet. Do your best to lose some weight. There's a disproportionate health benefit to a modest, achievable weight loss. 7 to 10 pounds. The system I'm talking about doesn't control weight to the pound. It sets a range for weight and simply states that the further you go outside that range, the harder it will be to use cognitive measures to achieve it. But 7 to 10 pounds is well within what I believe to be the achievable range. Don't berate yourself if you cannot normalize your weight. Most people can. This is a very powerful, age-old, evolutionary selected basic behavior, and don't berate anyone else either. And I'll point out to you that this is the same advice I would give anybody. Improve your health, exercise, eat a heart-healthy diet, try to stay at the leaner end of your range, and don't judge yourself or anyone else more harshly than can be defended by our understanding of biology. Now, I'll close with 2 other slides and tell you that I put forth this set of ideas in a Newsweek editorial about a year and a half ago. I think it was a year ago last September. And you can read the headline, "The Real Cause of Obesity, It's Not Gluttony, It's Genetics. Why Our Moralizing Misses the Point." Now, for a period of time on Newsweek, it was quite extraordinary because it was only posted online. It was the most talked about article on the web in Newsweek. It was #1 on their most circulated, most commented on articles. In fact, there were chat rooms that sprung up in Yahoo about this article. And so I wanted to close by reading you some selected comments of what turned out to be about 40 pages of them that make some points that I think illustrate the range of opinions about obesity. This is crap. What a complete load of apologistic crap. Crap was a popular word on this site. Not only am I supposed to forget that genetic defect or no, what a person puts in their own body is clearly their choice, but I'm also supposed to brainwash myself with some PC notion that disgusting oily fat is somehow attractive. Not my point exactly, but okay, ditto to the hogwash. Empowering obese people with yet another excuse is reprehensible. How many before and after ads for weight loss diet and exercise are there? Do they work? Sure, if you want to. Fat is as fat does. This is my favorite. I smell smoke. Goes by the name Smoke. I'll bet Dr. Friedman's buddy, don't call him skinny. And it turns out you end up with defenders on the web. And so my defender, T. Massan, said, and I bet Smoke's buddies don't call him smart. Okay, another, I don't think how I live my life is anyone else's business. My obesity is not hurting anyone else. Another, I often wonder if people vilify obese people because they're so visibly obvious and nothing makes you feel better than pointing out the mote in someone else's eyes. And then finally, are we animals or do we have an intellect and the ability to choose how we behave? Actually, I think this is a core point. I think as humans, we want to believe we're in control, even in cases where our control may be limited. And I think the notion that some people find it difficult to consider the possibility that aspects of our behavior are at least completely or partially beyond our ability to control them. After all, no one asks the question, why is it that every living organism, up to and including non-human primates, seems to manage their weight just fine without passing judgment on the heavier or thinner among the chimp community. And I think we could ask ourselves why we feel the need to make judgments when quite obviously the same biological system that's evident in all these animals still resides within us. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for giving me the opportunity to visit this wonderful place, and I hope to visit again someday.
Thank you, Professor Friedman, for that incredible talk. I'd like to invite our speakers back up to the table in front for the question and answer period. And I'd like the audience to submit questions either on the cards or by the internet. Thank you.
We're so on. Okay, great, thanks. When we see these behavioral changes as a function, I think of, for example, the 2 pictures of the boy that you showed, and his intake dropped as a function of his getting leptin. Do we have any idea what he reports about his food experience? Does he get less pleasure from food?
Yeah, so am I on?
I think so.
People hear me? There are 2 studies. There's one direct study to that, and another fMRI imaging paper that relate directly to this that I'll tell you about.
Okay.
First, the food preference story or the pleasure story. So there are lots of experiments or studies that have been done giving people food ranking scales, and everyone has their food preferences. Most people like chocolate cake better than they like broccoli.
Gee,
This child and others like him actually have no food preference whatsoever prior to the time they get leptin. Wow. And they don't begin to show the typical food preferences other people do until afterwards. And the explanation for that has been said to be that, that when you're starving, you don't really care where you get your calories from. And this child lives in a state of perceived starvation.
Okay.
Now, the fMRI imaging studies are equally interesting. If you image the brains of people who are fed or fasted in response to images of food versus non-food objects, typically a region of the brain centered in the reward centers, known as the nucleus accumbens, light up only if you're hungry, but not if you're fed.
Yes.
In these children, that region lights up in response to food, whether or not they've just eaten.
Okay.
And now you give the child leptin, and the child responds the same way as an average person would to presence or absence of food. And then the last thing I'll mention is that I think these changes on behavior extend well beyond just food preferences. It's mainly anecdotal because the numbers are small, but there's very good reason to believe that in the state of leptin deficiency, leptin treatment changes affective state, a number of other motivated behaviors, and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Frances?
I have a couple of questions. One, I'm curious is your thoughts on the study by Paul Kinney and Paul Johnson, the dopamine D2 receptor in addiction related to rats who fed a high-fat, high-salt, high-sugar diet for some weeks. I think it was a 2-year study. And after being on this diet for some time, they would endure electric shock in order to keep eating this kind of typical American diet. And when it was withheld, they refused healthy food for a while. So that sort of conformed to my own life experience when I was eating a fattier diet, that there was a lot of craving, and I wondered this dopamine factor.
Okay, so there's no question that these complex neural circuits, that a lot of neural circuitry is invested in getting your food intake right and best adapted for the environmental conditions that a species largely finds itself in. And there's a lot of additional pharmacologic evidence from blocking dopamine, blocking norepinephrine, modulating serotonin, that these key classical neurotransmitters play a role. Now, with respect to the notion that the first statement you made about animals becoming obese on a high-fat diet, I just want to point out that that's true for certain strains and not others. And so the reason I mention that is that probably there are genetic backgrounds that make you either susceptible or unsusceptible to the high-fat diet, and it's not a uniform thing. So I think that's what I was alluding to when I said there are interactions between genes and environment. Now, with respect to this issue of, it's not really shock, it's electrical stimulation in that setting, I'll simply say that those are cruder experiments that can be done currently, and there are ways to very specifically activate sets of neurons with actually light-sensitive channels and activating light, and we've been repeating some of those experiments more recently to try to understand how activation of dopaminergic pathways influence food preference and behavior. And I'll simply say that the results we see are not as profound as you just alluded to, and that we can see very sensitive and really lovely changes in preference and food intake with sort of a less dramatic stimulus to the midbrain than was seen in these previous studies. I could be more specific later, but anyway. So if the notion here is that animals prefer a high-fat diet to getting shocked, I think this story, in that case, the instruments may have just been a little too blunt.
Okay, Mary?
Yeah, the story you tell is a really powerful one, and I'm currently writing a book about calories, so I'm very interested in your work. And one of the things that sort of intrigues me is the extraordinary number of factors, genetically determined factors, that influence control over caloric intake and expenditure. And I'm wondering how, what kind of practical application it has, because people could have any number, they could be on a continuum, any place along a continuum of different kinds of factors. How would you ever sort it out?
Well, I sort of look at it as unsurprising in the following sense. I mean, what are the key behaviors a species has to undertake to survive? Well, you have to eat, you have to maintain your fluid balance, and you have to reproduce. So it shouldn't be that surprising or counterintuitive that we've devoted a lot of circuitry to getting it right and under a wide range of circumstances. Now, in a sense, you're right. It's very complicated and can seem overwhelming at times, but of course that's one of the advantages of a Mendelian approach. You know that a single gene plays a critical role and that that's an entry point you can work from there. Now, I think with where the state of knowledge is at the moment, I think the tools are such that you can begin to tease apart what factors are contributing. But just to give you an example of how hard it can be, I think one of the open questions is why gastric bypass works, because there's no question it will for morbidly obese people, though actually not as well as advertised. But setting aside the quantitative change, there's no question that people will lose weight on gastric bypass. Surgeons believe that that's the result not of an altered anatomy and an inability to absorb it, but rather a disruption of the interplay among these host of short-term signals, and that there's really a biologic basis. And that's a case where people are highly motivated to try to figure out what the cocktail of factors is that accounts for the weight loss with gastric bypass, and it's proven to be very difficult. So there are big challenges here. I think what I would simply argue to the best of my ability is that there is a clear biological basis, and that a key challenge moving forward is going to be to try to understand how caloric information of the sort you're referring to is read out and converted into adaptive biological responses.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah.
Dina?
Yeah. It wasn't clear to me, but my impression was that a lot of these experiments relate to food surplus contexts, where there's plenty of availability of food, but what happens in food scarce context, so that you may crave food, you may lack the hormone, but you don't actually observe it in the population because there's not enough food for the child to feed itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of analogous to the answer to the question about the high-fat diet. The point is that you have to have, no one becomes obese in an environment where there are no calories. So adequate calories are a necessary, but I would argue not sufficient condition for the development of obesity, because not everyone becomes obese when given free access to to calories. Now, the argument was made by Jim Neal at the University of Michigan in the 1960s that phenomena, this idea of caloric scarcity intermittently during evolution, accounts for the high rate of obesity now. That the only people who survive a famine are the people who have latent obesity, and it's those people who become obese, represent the obese members of the population later. I personally think that's only part of the story. I think there's a selective pressure to keep you alive when times are bad, but there's also something that resists massive obesity when times are good, and that evolution tries to figure out a happy medium between the two.
Okay, thank you. Question from the audience. Does the level of vitamin D have an effect with leptin's effect? Overweight in northern climate and lean people near the tropics, for example.
So I don't know of any data that speaks to that directly. Someone else on the panel might. But again, I think we're talking about complex pathways, so that it wouldn't surprise me if there are different ways in which other hormones or factors could interpose and act on the circuit. But I don't know of any specific data about vitamin D.
Okay. Here's a similar one. I don't know if you can answer this one either. I've heard that fructose intake can induce leptin resistance. Is this true? Are there other foods that reduce the production or efficacy of leptin?
Okay, so there are no known factors, dietary factors, that cause leptin resistance per se, and the available evidence would actually suggest that what causes leptin resistance is too much leptin. And what may happen, and this is a longer conversation, is that in certain individuals who become more obese, the leptin they make then downregulates the response to leptin and they ratchet up, as you might imagine. So it's a positive feedback loop. And there's evidence that that will happen in some strains of animals, but not others. But it doesn't appear to be calorie specific. And that raises another question that I think you may have been alluding to with your question, which is that there's a debate in the scientific community about whether all calories are interchangeable or whether it matters where you get your calories from. So you can see this debate played out in the lay press, where at the same time as there's a book that says don't eat fat, there's another book that says don't eat carbohydrate, and then another book that says don't eat anything. So I would say that I'm agnostic in that debate. There's no compelling evidence from human that I know of that clearly indicates whether calories, specific sources of calories, are worse than others. My bias, and I say it's a bias because there's no evidence one way or the other that's compelling, is that a calorie is a calorie, since in our bodies most calorie sources are interchangeable. But there's absolutely no way I could exclude that there isn't some other compound that has a direct, specific effect to reduce leptin sensitivity. If there is such a compound, I don't know what it is.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question from the audience. How does your work relate to the problem of anorexia?
Oh, well, you know, that's a really interesting question on two levels. First, anorexia and weight loss. If you look at anorectic patients, they typically have very low levels of leptin, which would seem to indicate that the problem is somewhere else. And I think by and large that's true. You know, there are other factors that influence body weight, and it's pretty clear that those factors can sometimes, internal factors probably, although we don't know that they're not partially external, can render you, enable you to ignore the signal that's normally associated with a low leptin level. One interesting fact, though, is that when anorectic patients gain weight, even small amounts of weight, they get a disproportionate increase in the amount of leptin they make, as if maybe leptin hypersecretion could be a permissive factor. But I also want to mention one other sort of what might seem to you to be orthogonal result recently about how the brain works and what we've learned in recent years. There's a condition known as narcolepsy. And narcolepsy is a sleep disorder, and people with narcolepsy, you know, will often nod off, you know, spontaneously in inappropriate situations. We now know that that condition is the result of the selective loss of a very specific neural population in the hypothalamus, the same region I've been talking about. And we would never have known about it if not for genetic approaches that Emmanuel Mignot undertook. And I mention this because I think we need to hold open the possibility that there could be subtle changes in the function or viability of specific nerve populations that control feeding that could account for a lot of these sort of syndromes, even anorexia nervosa. So there's a specific population of neurons in the brain known as the MCH neurons, or I mentioned the NPY neurons. And if you ablate these neurons, animals don't eat, and they get very, very thin. And so I think it is certainly possible that there are, quote, large psychological components to anorexia, and I don't doubt that there are, but there's also room for biological contributions, at least in some patients. And I think we'll learn a lot more about that in the coming decades.
Okay, I've got one more from the internet here. Can you comment on the impact that understanding the biological basis of obesity may have in dealing with the stigma usually ascribed to this condition?
Well, I think actually the stigma is diminishing somewhat. I think over time people are becoming more familiar with the idea that there are often biologic explanations and that there are probably more charitable interpretations of why some people are obese than is often applied. But it's pretty slow and nonetheless. And I would say that you could think to yourself, but it's almost the only human characteristic for which you have free rein to berate people. It's unbelievable. The things, I'm more sensitive to it because I follow. You just wouldn't believe the things that political figures say or actors say or comedians say that you could never get away with for any other human characteristic, especially one that we now know has a very powerful genetic basis. And I find that disturbing. Next time you hear someone publicly say something negative or nasty about obese people, try to substitute another human characteristic or condition for which that would be allowable. I don't think there's another one that comes to my mind. All right, maybe Yankee fan.
Oh.
I'm playing to, this is Minnesota.
All right, thank you very much. I want to thank our panel again for a wonderful day. We have to cut it short a little bit here so Dr. Friedman can catch his plane. Please come back and join us at 5:30 for the screening of the film Farming Forward, or at 6:30 for our panel, the Minnesota Food Forum. In between, please visit the exhibits in the forum, and if you wish, stop by the Hillstrom Art Museum. Thank you.